Here we're going to talk about the four most common errors in exposure blending. So the first one has to do with our brush settings. When we're exposure blending, it's extremely important to have a 100% opacity, 100% flow, and if you're a CC 2018 or above user, 100% smoothing. And this allows us to blend naturally without having any blotches in the areas that we're trying to blend. So for example, if we bring down flow to, let's say, 1%, and we bring down smoothing, let's say, to 50%. Again, if you're using anything earlier than CC 2018, you won't see smoothing. Now I'm going to do some exposure blending. So I have a darker exposure here and a base exposure on the bottom. So if I keep my darker exposure invisible, you don't have to follow along with this. I just want you to watch it so you can see the difference in the results. So I'm going to choose a bright one mask in Instamask, and I'm going to create a little bit more of a contrasting mask here. And if I'm happy, I can press select. I can choose a black mask and I can show that layer. And now I can hide the marching ants, and I've already got a big white brush selected. So watch what happens. I'm going to make the brush a little bit smaller. And in fact, I'm going to bring smoothing up to 100% and I'm going to bring flow up to around 40%. Now watch what happens if I paint in across the sky. So this is one sweeping movement, but then I move back and then I go down here and then I go up here and then I'm painting and it's all blotchy. It doesn't look very good. The reason why this is happening is because we've got flow at 41%. When you have flow, you can go over the same area a couple of times and it reinforces the selection. And so I see this quite often with people exposure blending skies. They might exposure blend by pressing the mouse button once here, maybe once there, and maybe once there, and it becomes very blotchy. So the best way to do it is have everything to 100%. And now watch what happens if we do that same thing again, but this time with everything set to 100%. Again, I'm going to make these exposures invisible. I'm going to create a bright one mask. Just bring that along to make it a bit more contrasting. Choose select, a black mask, show layer, and I've got my brush selected. So now with everything at 100%, I've got a large brush and I'm going to hide the marching ants. I can paint across the sky and keep my finger on the mouse button. You see, we're going over in one big movement like that. There are no blotches. There's no patchy masking. So if we look at the mask, we can hold down Alt on a PC or Control on a Mac to look at any mask. And that's what the mask looks like. But the mask of the other exposure where it was blotchy, as you can see, it's patchy in the sky. It doesn't look very good. And now this leads us to another problem. And this carries on from our last video. This exposure is too dark to blend in to this exposure here. So when we look at the horizon here, we have this black line going across here and the canyon in the back looks kind of strange. It looks too bright and a bit too soft. But if we bring down this exposure, let's say to around 65%, then all of a sudden that scene, that area looks much more natural. And there we've still recovered the sky. So it's a big improvement from our base exposure, but we don't have that black edging as much. And we have a much more natural transition between the canyon and the sky. To show you that again, here we have an image from Moab with a darker exposure on top and a base exposure at the bottom. And now I'm going to bring back some of the sky from that darker exposure. And when we zoom into this area here, you'll see we have these weird lines. Now this isn't movement between exposures. The reason why we have these lines, if I just disable that mask, is because on our brighter exposure, we have the edge of the arch. And on the darker exposure, we also have the edge of the arch. But you see, on the brighter exposure, it's clipped. Look, they're not in the same position. The arch in the brighter exposure ends around about here, but in the darker exposure, watch, it comes forward a few pixels. And if I need to zoom in a bit, just to show you that in a more exaggerated way, you see, so that's the problem. That's why we have this dark line. Now, there are two ways to fix that. Firstly is to use a less contrasting mask. So if we look at this mask, we've got the foreground, which is really black, and then we've got the sky, which is really white. So that's too much of a harsh transition between those two exposures. Now we're going to look at this a little bit more when it comes to actually talking about exposure blending and the different techniques we use. So don't worry if this is a bit confusing right now. So we've got a sharp transition here between the sky and the foreground. So that's why we have these lines in this example. Again, we can always bring down the opacity and that will fix the problem. So there we go. But we've lost some information in the sky. So now if I zoom in again, this time I can create a less contrasting mask. So if I delete that mask and I open up Instamask and I make this darker exposure invisible, then I create, let's say, a bright swan. But that's too general. That's probably going to be affecting the rest of the image. We need the foreground to be darkish and the sky to be quite light. So that looks quite good. And now if I click on blended, I can press apply and show that layer. And when we zoom in, we don't have that more obvious edging. You can see some slight edging along here, but not much. That's mainly chromatic aberration, which I didn't clean out earlier on when preparing these images. And so if I bring the opacity down just a little bit, we now have a cleaner result along the edges here. Now there is another reason why we'll sometimes have edging when exposure blending, and that's because our images are misaligned. So for example, we have a darker exposure here and a brighter exposure on top. And I'm just going to do a quick blend, nothing special. Just choose a bright swan, let's say, and apply that to the darker exposure. Now when we zoom in, we can see we've definitely got some edging here. And that's because if I make this mask invisible, disable the mask there, here's the before and after. The sticks are misaligned, so there must have been movement between the two exposures. Now an easy way to fix that is just, if I delete that mask, select these two exposures, go to edit, or to align all layers, or in Instamask, we click on align. And this will hopefully align our exposures. But let's say this didn't work and our exposures didn't align properly. Another way to fix that is to select the top exposure, change the blend mode of that to something called difference. When we do that, the white edging here shows us what is misaligned in our image, so what's different in our image. To line them up, press this move tool, click once on the exposure, and now choose your arrow keys on your keyboard, left and right. And you see we're realigning those exposures. And when the white has more or less disappeared, that means our exposures are aligned. So I can change this blend mode again to normal. Now if I zoom out and do exactly what I did before, just create my mask and then apply it. Now I can zoom in and you see we have no edging. What we have instead is a clean transition between the sticks and the sky. So you have to make sure your exposures are aligned correctly, and that's why I almost always use a tripod when shooting. Now please remember, Photoshop does not align smart objects, and we're going to be working with smart objects later, but I'm going to show you how to get around that as we approach those tutorials. The final common error in exposure blending is with contrast. You see, I sometimes get emails from photographers who send me images that look similar to this. Not the scene, but in terms of brightness. So usually they'll say they tried to exposure blend, but when they paint on the mask using luminosity masks, it affects the whole image. So I'm going to choose my Instamask here. I'm going to choose a bright swan, press select. I'm going to choose a black mask, show layer, hide the marching ants, and I'm going to make sure I have a nice big white paintbrush. So when I paint on this exposure, watch how it doesn't just affect the sky, and we're trying to bring back some information in the brightest parts by blending in that darker exposure. So far so good. And now when I go onto the foreground, look, we're also blending in the foreground. And if I do that again, you see we're really not doing a very precise job at blending these exposures, and we're actually pulling out fine detail in the foreground. We're flattening the image. Now, there's a very good reason why this is happening, and you probably already guessed why. There simply isn't enough information in this image to create a bright mask. In other words, we have no overexposed areas, and we also have no underexposed areas. Just to prove that, here is the histogram. Look, we've got no clipped highlights and no clipped shadows. Now that's great news, because that means we don't have to exposure blend. There's no need for luminosity masks. We can simply bring down any highlights we want and bring up any shadows in Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw, and that's it. We cannot blend exposures when there isn't enough contrast to create the masks we want. Like we've already seen in these examples, the mask that we're trying to create is quite contrasting. So it should have the area we want to select as nice and white and bright, and the area we don't want to select as a dark grey or black. Whereas here, our masks are flat. So we're not making any of the selections that we want to make. Now again, we're going to get into that even more when we start looking at real exposure blending and why we create the masks we create. So right now, I just want you to consider these errors, especially when you first start exposure blending. And if you have any problems when exposure blending, it might serve you well to come back to this video to make sure you're not falling into one of these traps.